It is finally official after 4 years of many ups, but also many downs. Sergio Perez and Red Bull are parting ways with immediate effect. From Racing News 365, my name is Nick Golding, and I'm delighted to be joined, as always, by lead editor Ian Parks. Ian, we said in Abu Dhabi that it would take something quite special to do another F1 update before the end of the year. Well, we've had obviously quite a special big announcement. Sergio Perez has been riding the Red Bull roller coaster for 4 seasons. However, he has finally reached the end of the ride.
Yeah, and I was just grabbing my phone there, Nick, so I could give people the exact wording of the statement. And it says, after 4 successful seasons together and following the conclusion of the longest Formula One season in history, Sergio Perez and Oracle Red Bull Racing have reached an agreement to part ways for 2025. Obviously, I emphasize the reached an agreement part there because quite clearly, as we discussed in both podcasts and updates previously, that this was always going to be a case of how does Red Bull get out of its contract that it signed with Sergio Perez in early June this year. As we know, Perez started the season reasonably well, scored good points, good podiums in the first handful of races, but then from race 7 onwards, it was absolutely an atrocious affair, scoring only 49 points in 18 Grand Prix. And of course, that cost Red Bull its constructors, or the defense of its constructors title this particular season that it had won the past 2 seasons. And so it was effectively a no-brainer that Red Bull would want to get rid of Checo Perez, for want of a better phrase. But of course, it had tied itself into this 1+1 contract that it had signed with Checo in June 2025. 1+1 being, of course, guaranteed for a year, option for 2026. And you can imagine the various clauses within that. You can imagine, bearing in mind the sponsors that Checo has on board with him and the role that they would arguably play in this as well, that it has taken this long, this past 10 days effectively, since the end of the season in Abu Dhabi a week and a half ago, for all this wrangling, toing and froing between the lawyers, you would assume, to finally reach this agreement now. And we finally have this parting of the ways. That is it now. Checo Perez's 4 years at Red Bull are over. As you say, he had some highs, but of course, the lows, especially over the last 18 Grand Prix this season, have been far too many to mention and have ultimately led to this decision that has been taken, that there will be a new teammate for Max Verstappen in 2025. And of course, we are all expecting that to be Liam Lawson. As we sit here recording this on Wednesday evening, following the announcement, we are expecting an additional announcement from Red Bull sometime on Thursday that will confirm that Liam Lawson will be Max Verstappen's teammate next season in 2025.
So, of course, keep an eye out on Racing News 365 for when that news breaks. But I mean, we've been waiting this evening to see who would make the announcement first. Would it be Checo? Would it be Red Bull? In the end, it was Checo. A really lovely social media post and a brilliant video kind of showing his journey with Red Bull and how in many ways it all started with that famous first win for him in the Sakir Grand Prix back in 2020. And actually, you know what? There's no doubting that, unfortunately, it has been a sad exit for Checo. It's not been a good season for him. You mentioned there 49 points in the last 18 races this year is staggering. I don't think that's a big enough word to explain it, but actually, you know, on his day, he is a brilliant racing driver.
He is, and he proved it on numerous occasions. Obviously, he arrived at Red Bull with the best of intentions, that intention being, of course, to not only be a team player, to help Red Bull win the Constructors' Championship that it had not done since the end of the Sebastian Vettel era, but of course to hopefully, potentially, challenge Max Verstappen. A challenge that had previously eluded the likes of Alex Albon and Pierre Gasly, even Daniel Ricciardo to an extent, bearing in mind that Daniel effectively had the reasonable upper hand over Max when Max first joined the team. But of course, Max soon started to exert himself on that team and slowly become the number one player. And it's one of the reasons why Daniel eventually left Red Bull to join Renault because he felt he was not getting a fair rub of the green at that particular time as Max's teammate. That's one for people to debate, of course, but that, of course, was the general perception. So, of course, as I say, Checo went there with every intention of challenging Max to finally being someone that could stand up to him, to prove themselves as an equal racer. And of course, it never really happened. For the most part, he ended up once again being, as former teammates eventually became, that number two, that wingman to Max, and never was that greater exemplified than, of course, the 2023 season, where, as we all know, Max could quite comfortably have won the Constructors' Championship on his own. However, Checo did play a superb role in that season. He helped Red Bull secure the 1-2 in the Drivers' Championship for the first time in the team's history. But of course, the great example of Checo's wingman role was, of course, when he earned that quite now famous moniker,
Yeah.
the Mexican Minister of Defense, for what he did in the 2021 Abu Dhabi Grand Prix, that season concluding epic race that will long go down in the history of Formula One, when he managed to hold Lewis Hamilton at bay for quite a period of time over a number of laps. And that aided Max Verstappen's cause in that Grand Prix. Yes, of course, we all know the circumstances, the way they played out in the end, but never was Checo's skills as a racing driver better, as I say, exemplified than in that little cameo during that Grand Prix. And over the course of the period of time that he's had at Red Bull, he has, of course, proven himself to be a very capable number two driver. And unfortunately, it has just gone completely awry for him over this past season. He was predominantly coming out with excuse after excuse as to why the car wasn't working for him, why this happened, why that happened, why he wasn't getting out of Q1, why he wasn't, scoring points in the top 10. And unfortunately, it just became a litany of excuses that just too much in many respects. He was going too far with some of those excuses. Yes, we know he's had issues with the car, but he's just never been able to quite get on top of it, be at one with it. And ultimately, when you see what Max has done with that RB20, still dragging results out of that car, still dragging qualifying performances, dragging Grand Prix performances out of that car compared to what Checo was achieving, then it was, as I say, and I'm going to use the words again, a no-brainer for this parting of the ways.
You mentioned Daniel Ricciardo, and of course, it did look like that Max ultimately was just too much for him. A similar story, of course, with Pierre Gasly, Alex Albon with Max was just too superior. Do you think that's the same reason now for Checo's demise, or actually is it more a case of maybe Checo with his age is simply just reaching, his limit almost?
I think very much the latter. I don't think it's anything to do with age. I still think that when he was on it, and we saw in the Azerbaijan Grand Prix, once again,
Yeah.
that street circuit that he absolutely adores, he had his moments. He proved that when the opportunity was there, when a car was seemingly there beneath him at a circuit that he, as I say, adored, then he could still produce something out of the bag. And of course, he was so very nearly going to be on the podium and in that drought of his. And it culminated in just yet another instant that it's one of those that I remember debating long and hard with both yourself and Sam in one of
Yeah.
our podcast episodes as to who was at fault. And it was one of those that neither driver was predominantly or wholly to blame at the end of the day. And it was just a very unfortunate circumstance for Checo. It robbed him of a number of points. You kind of feel that it also robbed him potentially of what might have been something that could have aided his momentum to pull himself out of that slump. But of course, ultimately what happened, it just dragged him further into the mire from which he was never ultimately able to recover.
And just finally, let's do a bit of speculating because obviously Perez is financially, obviously, a very big figure for Red Bull, or at least was. And of course, has a huge backing in Mexico and has always been crucial to the Mexico City Grand Prix. What do you think could be next for Checo? Could it maybe be the Cadillac entry in 2026? Because you've got to think, with him not being on the grid, that this could be a concern to the Mexico City Grand Prix organisers.
You can imagine there's going to be a lot of drivers throwing their hat into that particular ring for
Yeah.
Cadillac in 2026. Daniel Ricciardo, potentially Valtteri Bottas. We know he's potentially eyeing that seat. Franco Colapinto, who knows? All these guys are going to be in the reckoning. And of course, you would assume that Checo Perez is very much going to be eyeing that particular seat, because there's a lot riding on who those two drivers are going to be for that brand new entry. They're going to be, as I say, a lot of eyes on those seats. And yes, Checo does bring with him a considerable amount of sponsorship money. And whilst GM, to a certain degree, is a wealthy entity in itself, and given the collaboration that it's got, no longer with the Andretti organization per se, but certainly it is still the Andretti organization under a different name, then there is huge finances on board for that team, but it is still going to want some help financing that particular project. And who knows, maybe with all those sponsors that Checo has. And I just saw an Instagram post only this week for another tequila provider, Patron, one of his sponsors, doing something for them. So we know he's still going to have this backing going forward. And yes, it's going to be invaluable backing for whoever decides now to give him a seat. Does he go IndyCar route 2025? Do something there? Can't see NASCAR, very much doubt that, but certainly you can see him in IndyCar.
Yeah.
Maybe any WEC program that he might be able to line himself with, although a lot of teams have already got their driver lineups, of course, confirmed for next season, as you would naturally expect, as we've seen in Formula One. Or we're now pretty much all but confirmed, bar this one seat. But of course, we're expecting Liam to be promoted, and then of course, once Liam is promoted from Red Bull / Racing Bulls, as they're going to be only 25, we are expecting the additional announcement of one of Red Bull's juniors, Isaac Hadjar, to then join Yuki Tsunoda alongside RB. So yes, with regard to Checo, it's a case of watch this space. And if you check out his Instagram post, which Nick mentioned earlier, it is actually quite a lovely post. And there is an open-ended kind of message right at the end as to what's the next chapter in my career, because it's not over.
No.
Just because this might be the end of this particular chapter with Red Bull today, Wednesday, as we talk. It's definitely not the end of his motorsport career, and it may not yet be the end of his Formula One career, as we're discussing right now. There may just be that seat available at Cadillac. Well, we know there's going to be 2 seats available, and you can imagine that he's probably going to be throwing his hat firmly into the ring for that one when the time comes.
Yeah. And of course, to those watching this video, let us know in the comment section below where you think Checo will end up next and what you think overall about him parting ways with Red Bull. This has been a special episode of the F1 Update from Ian and I imagine we'll probably be seeing you again very, very soon. See you later.
Take care as always, folks.